Greetings, everyone. We're so happy that you all can join us for this special edition of Open Up. We have a very special guest today, Dr. Ken Duckworth. Just a little bit about myself first. My name is Dipchand Ramcharitar. I'm the Outreach and Development Coordinator here at Voice of Men 360. We are a nonprofit organization that seeks the interests of men and boys. We're predominantly based in London, Ontario, Canada. So let's welcome Dr. Ken Duckworth. He is the Chief Medical Officer of NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. He's board certified in adult and child and adolescent psychiatry and is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He's also the author of the excellent book called You Are Not Alone. Welcome to the program, Dr. Ken Duckworth.
Thank you so much, Dipchand. Great to be here.
Yes, it's a pleasure having you. And let's dive right in. First of all, can you tell us what inspired you to write this book, You Are Not Alone?
Yeah, so you have to go back to my little childhood. So I had a very loving dad with very severe bipolar disorder. And back in the day, and I'm talking 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s,
right,
it was understood that no one could talk about it. So, it was like a hurricane would come into the house every 2 to 3 summers. And my dad was so loving and so much fun. It was really hard to understand what this was. So this is how you take a kid who would probably have been a high school history teacher. And I'm like, I'm going to go to medical school. I'm going to make sense of this. I'm going to try to figure this out. And so that's kind of my life path. And when I was in high school, I read Studs Terkel's book, Working, which was asking real people how they experience their jobs. And I always thought that one of the things that was missing from the literature was asking real people what they had learned about living with bipolar disorder for 30 years or loving somebody who has schizophrenia for decades. And that, in all the randomized controlled trials to I was exposed at Harvard, I like randomized controlled trials. I always felt like this was a gap. The idea that people who've lived with things have also learned things turns out to be quite radical. And I had proposed this book, NAMI's first book, and 5 publishers were interested in it, and I had never written a book before. So I thought it was a good moment to do this. This was not long after the pandemic. I'd often wanted to write this precise book. And then the world kind of came to me in a way because people were talking about mental health very openly. But my origin story is very personal. And that's why, the work that NAMI does is just fantastic. And it's a dream job for me.
Yeah, there obviously is a hunger for this type of literature to be out there. And, generally we've been inundated with a lot of mental health stuff. And only recently, I would say, I can't give you an exact time, but there's been more of an emphasis on mental health, which is good because it seems to be escalating in all directions, from young to old people out there. So it's a welcome book from you, and I'm sure everyone would benefit a lot from it. So if we can get a little more into the personal aspect, how do you see a person's lived experience, which you've advocated for a fair bit, impacting their mental health outcome?
Yeah, so a lot of people in the book told me they had become peers, that they had made the decision to help other people. And what they described to me was going through whatever they'd gone through, misdiagnosis, living with severe depression, being suicidal, hearing voices every day, that one of the ways that helped them process the experience was to help other people with it. And so in this way, what people are describing is mastering their experience by helping other people. So I would say that was pretty profound. The other thing that was interesting to me was that, I'd send an email to all 130 people that I interviewed for the book. And I'm like, hey, another, version is coming out. A paperback has come out. If you want to get out of the book, please feel free. And they all emailed me, no, we want to sell more books. I want more people to know about what I've been through because I believe that what I've been through can help another person. So this kind of changes the whole power dynamics around living with a mental health condition. This option wasn't really available to people like my dad in the
Right.
70s, 80s, and 90s, and isn't for everyone now, but it's a new gear. And if you want to do it, you can do it.
Of course. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so we all know a man's lack of inclination when it comes
Mm.
to opening up about their mental health issues. So on that subject, what challenges do you see men facing when it comes to seeking help for mental health, and how best can those barriers be addressed?
Boy, this is such a challenging question because I remember when I was young and had no gray hair, the National Institute of Mental Health had a program to get men to seek help for depression. And it was a multimedia phenomena. And they really found at the end that men didn't want to seek help for depression. That was just one example. So, we're into the complex cultural area now. But I will say, if you flip through the book, if you pick it up at the library or if you happen to buy a copy, all the royalties go to NAMI. So you don't have to feel guilty about buying the book.
Right.
I interviewed about 50 or 60 males. And so, a higher number of females, but not dramatically. And some of the males were dads. Some of them had been suicidal. Some of them were reluctant to seek help because of their upbringing or their culture. The religious community that they were in discouraged them from seeking help. People were told to pray it away. So I feel like it's pretty complicated in terms of the cultural threads that get us there. I babysit my grandson every Monday, and he's 20 months old. And so when he can't do something, I've taught him the word help. And help, I can pick him up. Help, I can get him into his car seat. Help, I can do something. It seems so easy for an infant who hasn't been socialized. I guess he's a toddler now. He's just under 2.
Right.
It's so easy for a boy. He's definitely all boy. He's obsessed with trains, trucks, fire stations. I mean, he's all boy. And so it's not wired in so much, I don't think. I think it's something we create in the culture that he routinely asks for help every single time I'm visiting with him. But somehow, I think men in our society have come to the conclusion that it would be better if they didn't seek help. And so this is an ongoing challenge, but I was pleased. I interviewed some fathers in this book, and the fathers were working on their relationships with their sons and their relationships with their daughters. And they were very open and honest about how the culture had impacted them, like that their wife had to drag them into getting going on this. And once they got it, they really got into it because they really loved their kids. But, I met a man from Wisconsin who basically said, my wife had to drag me to every single one of these meetings and conversations. I didn't want to do this. Once I got there, I thanked her, but it was really hard for me to do so. So it remains a challenge. I'm glad your podcast exists so people can think about it and talk about it. I mean, I think that's how we make a difference. But I do think this is fundamentally cultural.
Right.
I don't think this wired into people.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that if you think it's more a social stigma issue as opposed to it being an inherent trait in men.
Well, now, we've gotten into a bro culture thing, in our American society. Perhaps the Canadians have figured out how to avoid some of these American excesses. But, people are now, generating wealth and building rocket ships. That's not really very self-reflective. And it doesn't really involve the concept of, I wonder if I could learn more about myself or do better or make sense of this problem that's impacting my family. So unfortunately, I think some of the culture is going in the opposite direction to help seeking, just given the presence of these American media and media company stars. They don't seem to be very self-reflective. Building big yachts and shooting off rockets is kind of primitive male behavior in some ways.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Now, normally when we talk about doctor-patient relationship, we tend to focus a lot on the patient, which makes sense.
Yes,
But
of course.
I want to switch a little bit and ask you, in layman's terms, what are some of the difficulties you encounter when dealing with patients?
Well, I think I'd say there's a long list of challenges. One is people have delayed help so long that their illness has developed a more active version. So if you were to use cancer as a metaphor, and it's not a perfect metaphor,
Right,
but people who see a mole on their cheek and go get it addressed, that's stage one. If they ignore it for 9 years and then it's in their bones, that's stage four. It's metastasized. That's harder to treat in almost virtually every single case. So one of the things that was done in Australia primarily, and I think the Canadians, the Europeans, and now the Americans have picked it up, is, for example, an early psychosis treatment movement. This is called coordinated specialty care in America, where
right,
if you have paranoid thoughts or feelings that you're afraid of in fundamental ways, you can go to the one of 400 programs across America. So getting help early is both an internal process. I'm willing to seek help. I'm willing to do what my grandson does and say the word help. I need help. You have to be able to say that, but then the help has to actually be there. And this is one of the other challenges we face is we have a real shortage of a workforce, and it's hard to find people to take care of somebody you love or yourself. So this leads to longer duration of untreated illness. And so in the example of psychosis, DUP, the duration of untreated psychosis, correlates with difficulties. So I think it's important to just remember that. So the internal resistance you have to finding help, then the system being difficult to navigate here in the States anyway. I'd be very interested in your Canadian perspective. I suspect it's better, but I suspect it's not magically better. And I think it
no,
was,
yeah, no, I think we have our own struggles when it comes
yes,
to all facets of the healthcare system. So yeah, it's very complex, very complicated, and
yeah,
it costs a tremendous amount of money, to be able to offset the cost of public health.
yeah.
So
So,
um,
so those are two big problems that I focus on. Another is the problem of misdiagnosis.
right,
People are seen one time by a clinician who in America has to fill out a form so that they can get paid through their clinic, and they have to
right,
give a diagnostic impression. And diagnosis is made in a movie, not a snapshot. So if I see a person one time and they look a certain way, that's a snapshot, but you have to assemble dozens of snapshots to get a movie together.
for
And a
sure.
person's mental health story and their strengths is a movie. It's not a snapshot. So that's another weakness that I see. I was told that I had this condition. Well, that person only saw them one time.
Okay.
And, I'm spending, multiple visits with them, and I have a much better sense of what's cooking, what's going on, and what we can do about it. So I think it's important to know your diagnosis as a rough draft.
Right.
You are not personally your diagnosis. It's more information to help inform your thinking.
Yeah. On a related front, do you see a critical need for government or private entities, such as the pharmaceutical companies out there, to invest more in mental health research?
Yeah, one of the big challenges that we face is because the underlying mechanisms in neuroscience are elusive. That is to say, we don't know what causes bipolar disorder. We don't know. It's a very simple statement. We don't know what causes schizophrenia. We don't know. We don't know what causes PTSD, borderline personality disorder. Well, in PTSD, we know the incident event, the acute stressor, but I can't tell you neurochemically, and neither can anyone else. So I think one of the great challenges we have faced, a lot of the major pharmaceutical companies have exited the neuroscience space. They've said this is just too hard because it takes an enormous amount of money to start up. One of the things we're seeing is that smaller companies, biotech companies, are doing research,
Right.
And then when they're successful, the larger companies may buy them. So this is a different kind of model than we used to have, but we'll take anything we can get. But I think the underlying problem is not that the pharmaceutical companies are unwilling to participate per se. I think it's because it's so hard and the barriers to getting it right are so high. Some of them have exited the stage. NAMI worked with people at NIMH to do the AMP Schizophrenia Project, the Accelerated Medicine Partnership. And that's a $100 million public-private jumpstart to try to look at the underlying biological mechanisms of people who convert to psychosis. And maybe that would be something that could help get the pharmaceutical companies back in the game. Because I think they've decided it's really hard. And I think you see this also in the Alzheimer's research community, some of the other brain-based conditions. These are hard conditions to find a therapeutic agent for. Obviously, we'd love to see more of it, but in a capitalist system, people have to feel that they're developing, a return.
For sure. And then I knew someone who worked in research and development for a drug company.
Mm-hmm.
She told me the amount of hoops they had to jump through just to get the product to a stage where they can forward it to the FDA for approval,
Right.
which I believe used to take at least 10 years. So a long, drawn-out process. And, some of these pharmaceutical companies, I'm sure they invest a lot of time, money, and resources to get a product on the market.
Well, then that's the regulatory environment, right?
Yeah.
And so, that's another complexity. These are complex equations. You mentioned complexity in Canadian healthcare, right? Drug discovery is similarly complex. You just can't do it. You have to prove that it's safe. Then you have to go through this hoop. Then you have to go through that hoop.
Yeah.
Then you have to present the data to a larger advisory committee. Then the advisory committee has to review. There's a lot of steps and a lot of money on the line.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons this has become so difficult.
Yeah, and then when you're talking about the general public, you can't really cut corners, when you're trying to get a drug on the market. You have to ensure you do the proper research.
You got to do safety.
The safety and all that, yeah.
Yeah, it has to be safe and effective. And that's why, I happen to like the FDA's mission.
Right.
Don't approve things that aren't safe and effective. But I think some people would complain that regulatory, steeplechase has gotten too complex.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a controversial area. So, it has its, plus and minuses.
That's right.
When it comes to individuals, what resources would you recommend for individuals seeking mental health support, but they're unsure where to start?
Well, I'm sure in Canada, there's a way to find help. In America, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which is the largest group of people with mental health conditions and their families, has a helpline, 1-800-950-NAMI.
Right.
You get 100,000 calls a year. You could also go to NAMI.org and find out where there are groups near you. While we are said to be only in America, the truth is there are groups in Canada, and these are like-minded groups. We're not trying to organize our efforts in Mexico or Canada, but things do, find their way to people who need them. Is there a Canadian equivalent, like a one-stop shop?
In terms of
finding help, like you're looking for support. Do you talk to your primary care provider?
Yeah, I think there's Ontario Medical Association. I think you can call them, and they can give you some sort of directives in terms of medical health doctors and whatnot. So I think it's there. I've never used it myself, but I believe it's there for the public to access. So,
do you have a national crisis lifeline? So in the United States, NAMI worked very hard. ICANN did not do any of this work, but the policy team did. So we have a 3-digit number people call 988 for mental health support, and that cuts the police out of it. Because when you're in a mental health crisis, you tend to not need the police. And it's not fair to ask the police to become social workers instantaneously. So what's the equivalent in Canada?
I am not sure.
Got it.
I'm not sure what we have here. There might be something. We do have some organizations, nonprofit and whatnot, that reach out to people in case of mental health crisis. We ourselves at Voice of Men 360, we're trying to get more involved in that. Obviously,
Mhm.
to a certain degree, because when expert help is needed, we can't tamper with that. We can only go so
No, of
far,
course. Well,
right?
support, education, encouragement, changing the culture, those are very valuable things. But, at NAMI, we know that the average volunteer is not a clinician, can't make a diagnosis,
Yeah.
but our education programs have been found to be effective and safe. And so I think it's also valuable as a supplement, not as a replacement.
Yes, for sure. What about people who's already like public who's already getting treatment? What advice would you give someone who is struggling to find effective treatment, or frustrated with their mental health care that they're receiving
Yeah.
right now?
I interviewed a bunch of people that were told by their practitioners that they would never get better. I interviewed people who were told that they shouldn't have a family because they wouldn't be good at it. And of course, over time, people found a way and they did get better and they did have a family. So I would say there was a whole subset of people that were given adverse advice about their future by professionals. If you get that advice, I encourage you to ignore it. No psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker has ever been trained to predict the future. All we can do is provide good information and adequate support. So, for example, I was told there was a certain patient I had at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center in Boston. I was told by a very famous psychiatrist who was a full professor, way higher than me, that this man would never leave the hospital. Within a couple of years, a new medicine called clozapine came out. And when that patient got on the medicine, he got dramatically better. And so I think it's very important to not believe pronouncements about your future. And I also think it's important to try things. So finding like-minded people, like at a NAMI group, is another pathway. Find other people like you. What are they doing to work the problem? What have they found to be helpful? What support groups, what education groups, what things have they done? How do you become a peer specialist? How do you take what you've learned as lived experience and turn it into a professional identity? These are really good questions, it seems to me.
Absolutely. Can you share more details about NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Health?
Yeah, so the National Alliance on Mental Illness was started in 1979. So psychiatrists, I think misapplied psychoanalytic theory and blamed a lot of mothers for their son's schizophrenia. And 1979 was the same time that we were having deinstitutionalization happen across America. And the moms are like, wait a second, they're blaming us and dads too, but mostly moms. They're blaming us and then they're sending our kids home because they're closing the state hospital. So, what the heck is that? We also have 3 or 4 other kids that are fine. I don't think it's our parenting. I actually think that's a misapplied theory. Let's see if we can discover an underlying science reason for why one kid might have schizophrenia out of 4 kids. And so NAMI became initially an advocacy group to fight for more bioscience, better research, kind of some of the things we were talking about earlier, to try to figure out the underlying biological mechanisms,
Right.
because blaming parents is not an effective way to make a difference. I
Of course.
interviewed people for NAMI's first book, You Are Not Alone, who were blamed by practitioners. And so this is not from, 1890. This is from the 1990s, right? This is not forever ago. So I think it's really important to remember that while professionals are not taught this now, if you get the message that you're not going to get better, I think it's very important to ignore that. Practitioners have nothing on you in terms of predicting the future. If they were, all of them would be multimillionaires because they could predict the stock market, the
Yeah.
electoral results. They could bet on anything, right? All they have is a set of clinical skills, but they should not be predicting your life course. Very important. So I think that's a great example. And I'm going to say a substantial subset of the people I interviewed
Yeah.
ran into that problem.
Oh, okay. And now I know we talked a bit that you've been, a few times to Canada. But I wanted to ask you if you've actually done any research in Canada, and if so, what did you find out about mental health issues?
Well, I think most of us Americans envy the Canadian system, but I have not done any research in it. As I mentioned, I went to school in Ann Arbor. I grew up in Detroit. We used to zip
Right.
across the Ambassador Bridge to buy Labatt's, right?
Yeah.
So, just to connect, we're 18-year-olds. It's like, hey, let's go have fun in Canada. There were no passports. Everything was easy back then. It was easier in so
Right.
many ways. What people say about the Canadian system is that, it's less fragmented and chaotic because there's not multiple payers. And I
Yeah.
think the fact that there's one payer does eliminate a layer of American complexity, because we have another complicating feature, which is that there are companies trying to make profits out of healthcare. Now, you might not have enough practitioners. You might have long waiting lines. You might
Yeah.
feel frustrated as well. But you don't also have third parties trying to generate money from these endeavors. So I think most psychiatrists in America envy their Canadian peers and think, while it may not be heaven, I suspect it's better than what we're working with.
Yeah, well, we all have our share of problems, but
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. The more layers, it gets more complicated with more layers. It costs more money, more
Yeah.
time is involved, more frustrations to deal with. So,
Yeah.
it's our system. I would say, I'm personally, I'm very happy with it. Again, it could be better. I'm not in some situations where people are waiting on surgery, and it gets more and more frustrating and
Yeah.
dangerous to a certain extent when you have to wait months at a time. So that is an issue. But again, there are upsides to the system as well.
Yes.
And I've seen situations. Again, I'm talking anecdotally from my own experience that I've been treated well at some of the health facilities I've visited here.
Mm-hmm.
So
Good.
I want to switch to about you and the book you've written. So when you look back after writing this book, after all these years of your medical professional experience, what did you learn about yourself, your dad, and others who have gone through some life challenges, movements, especially when it comes to mental health?
Yeah. So I think, the book taps into the idea that if you've lived with something, you may have learned something. And there's a kind of professional understanding that that's not important. And in hanging out at NAMI and what I learned in my own family, my dad and I had a great relationship, even though we couldn't talk about things in a constructive way. I learned that you could still have a very loving relationship. And I was like, isn't that interesting? So I got interested in this idea, what real people have learned. I met a man who has bipolar disorder. A dog helps him regulate his schedule. Now, does he take medicines? Yes. Does he do psychotherapy? Yes, he does. He's doing important things. Does he do social rhythm therapy? Does he wake up at a certain time? He
Right.
does those things, but he also has a dog. And the dog gets up first thing in the morning. He gets up with the dog. The dog eats, he eats. He takes the dog for a walk. He goes to graduate school. The dog sleeps at home. He comes home at lunch. He takes care of the dog. And what he told me is that by minding this creature who has a rhythm in their own lives biologically,
Wow.
it was helping him manage that. Now, I think you could train at a famous fancy program in psychiatry for 1,000 years and never have learned that, because you'd have to ask a person. I met
Right.
a woman who was raising young kids and was having a lot of psychiatric vulnerabilities, a lot of symptoms, really struggling. And she said to me, I was realizing that I couldn't run my household, that actually I was going under all the time. So she goes to a group meeting with other people with mental health conditions. And this woman says, oh, you know what helped me?
Yeah.
Paper plates. Don't do any dishes, not one dish. Don't do a dish until your children are out of the house. Then you can do all the dishes you want. It's too much. You're doing too much. Cook one meal a week, right? Throw in something, here and there, but have a base meal that
Yeah.
you're working off of for the week, and don't do any dishes. because she was complaining that the dishes were piled so high in her
Right.
sink. And so, she learned that from another person. So I think there's some power in the idea that regular people also have learned something. This is not anti-professional.
Right.
I like randomized controlled trials. I like psychotherapy. I like medications. I like those tools. Those are tools. They're power tools. And there's ordinary wisdom that people have also picked up. Because if you lived, with being suicidal for 10 years, you've probably learned something about coping with that. And that's kind of what I was interested in the book was what was the lessons that real people had learned? How had men overcome their cultural vulnerabilities to find help? That's a good question. And people talked about that. How did men learn to live with symptoms even when the treatments are inadequate? I had a man tell me who hears voices every day in his life that he's on clozapine, which is the treatment-resistant psychosis medicine that is
Right.
FDA approved. He has loving family. He's got a brother who's a football coach. He's got a place to go on Friday night. He's a Meals on Wheels expert. All the little old ladies are in love with him. He's a fantastic guy.
Yeah.
He hears voices every day. He hears voices every single day.
Oh, wow.
And he said, it took me a very long time to realize that I had to really accept this. Then he pauses and he said, really accept it. That you don't have to be the CEO of Google to have a good life. You just have to accept what you cannot change. And he has gotten good treatment, good medicines, good love, good family. He's got a lot of things going for him. And he said, it took me about 2 decades of fighting the voices, hating the voices, battling the voices. And he said, and the next day after I had this realization, I woke up and there they were. And I was like, okay, radical acceptance. I'm going to go ahead and enjoy my life in spite of the fact that these are here. So that's the kind of thing you don't hear from people, in traditional research. You don't hear from people, how did they live with something that seems so hard to live with? So this was the joy of writing this book. The book was a USA Today bestseller. It's
Right.
helped a lot of people. I have a little house on Cape Cod. I go to the local Dinky library. There's always 3 people that have checked the book out ahead of me. That makes me so happy because I feel like, other people want to learn from real people. So it was a very, very good project.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The next question is a bit of a long one, so just bear with me. It relates to suicide mostly. So, in the last 10 to 20 years, there have been many services, training, and organization focusing on suicide. And the number of deaths caused by suicide is rising more and more every year. The stats show that 78 to 80% of men died by suicide around the world within the ages mostly 19 to 25. So where is the missing link? Why do we see more and more deaths by suicide every year? And what needs to be done to address this?
Yeah, I think worldwide, the number's about, I've heard 900,000 people per year. And it is more men than women. It is more use of violent means. Men tend to have guns. If you look at the states in America where it's hard to find guns, I happen to live in Massachusetts. Very low suicide numbers compared to the Western states, which are very gun friendly.
Right.
Wyoming, Montana, Nevada. You get the idea. Alaska. Those states in America have very high suicide rates. And so I think some of it is access to the means. Now, the suicidality that we see in teenagers, that may be social media. That's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah.
But I think you've seen in Australia and in many school districts, people are trying to say, wait a second, these kids are getting bullied off hours. Right? People are leaving hostile quotes for these kids and they're being humiliated. And as you know, adolescence is hard work. It's difficult to grow up. You're trying to figure out who you are. And criticism that's public is something that I think is a new problem and challenge that we have to face. So I think this does relate to men not seeking help, that men represent the majority of people who die by suicide by a fairly substantial amount. I think that directly connects to not being willing to seek help until later. And of course, men and guns is a definite problem in terms of people's kind of impulsive desperation. So in Massachusetts, it's hard to get a gun.
Right.
So somebody might get drunk and get into a fight and get beaten up.
Okay.
That's not the same as suicide, right? In the Western states, people have guns.
Right.
And the suicide rates there are substantially higher. So I think one of the things we learn is that people have distress everywhere. But if you don't have access to weaponry, your chances of dying are much smaller.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I have one more question for you, but before we get to that, I want to give some further information about our organization. First of all, let me go through our disclaimer. We would like to remind you that Voice of Men 360's mission is always delivered with good faith towards peaceful harmony. The views and opinions expressed in today's episode are those of our speakers and do not necessarily represent Voice of Men 360. Our organization engages in discussion forums to offer inspiration and create awareness of the issues of men who wish to overcome their life challenges. We are not providing medical or therapeutic advice. Should you require that type of assistance, we recommend you contact a medical professional immediately. If you have any questions or concerns about today's episode or any Voice of Men 360 content, please email us at that should be info@voiceofmen360.org. We would encourage more and more people to get involved with our organization. We, as I said, we're Voice of Men 360, and we're based in London, Ontario, Canada. If you want to be part of our audience or you want to be part of our programs, you can always join us. I'm going to give out some information as how you can get into contact with us. If you want to be, for example, a guest speaker on one of our shows, you are welcome to do so. Our phone number is 226-289-8784. Email address info@voiceofmen360.org. Our website is www.voiceofmen360.org. We're on Facebook. We do have a group page on Facebook as well. Please join us there. And we're all over social media. We're on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok. Please, we ask you if you can join or subscribe to our YouTube channel, Voice of Men 360. We'd really appreciate that. So, Dr. Ken Duckworth, it's been a pleasure and a privilege having you with us. We have one final question for you. Where can one get more information about your book, You Are Not Alone? And also tell us about your work in general, how anyone can get a hold of you or the organization you represent.
Yeah, so the National Alliance on Mental Illness is the largest group of people with mental health conditions and the people who love them in the world. And I happen to be very fortunate to be their chief medical officer. So I run a webinar series that you might find interesting.
Right.
Go to www.nami.org and then search for Ask the Expert. So if you're interested in understanding some of the research that's out there, I just had a person on the new weight loss drugs and how they relate to people with antipsychotic usage. I have one of the leading thinkers on mental health and depression on next week on the 13th of February. And of course, our book is available everywhere books are sold. We've sold a lot of them. It's been a really fun project. And the people in the book are proud to be part of it. They all volunteered. They wanted to tell their story to help other people. So I think it's a good way to think about it. www.nami.org is our organization. If you want to type in your address or your zip code, you can find out if there's a group near you. And I want to say I salute the work you're doing.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure to be on your podcast. And take good care, everybody.
Thanks again, Dr. Duckworth, and to the audience out there. Again, we really appreciate you joining us today. And thanks to Sivam. He's behind the controls. You're not seeing him, but he's the one that's behind the controls there. So from all of us here at Voice of Men 360, we are very happy that you were able to join us today. And we want to say good night, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be. Goodbye.